Well, it's certainly a perilous time as it relates to cybersecurity. So the number of breaches, number of attacks are going up. But also kind of in a bizarre way, it's actually a very exciting time as well. Because what we're now seeing is a lot of organizations and groups and vendors and analysts are now really stepping back and rethinking security. And part of this rethink of security, what I'm going to talk about today, is this concept called the zero trust security model. And so I'm going to dive a little bit into it. At the same time, there's a set of new technologies, machine learning, big data, et cetera, that now can be applied to the security problems that we're facing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And the feedback that I'm going to give you guys is based on a couple data points that I think that I uniquely can bring to the party. First of all, my company has 5,000 companies that use our technology to secure their environment. But also, we also operate a cloud security platform, and we're constantly under attack. So we're learning as we're being attacked all the time. And then finally, and I think a lot of you guys probably also experience this as well, as a CEO, I'm constantly being impersonated by people on the outside trying to get people on the inside to wire money, give W-2 information, et cetera. So I'm going to kind of bring all these things together and talk about this concept called zero trust. But before I do so, there we go. Just want to give a few updates. So I had the fortune to present last year, and last year I talked about, as it relates to the government, talked about the election, talked about Office of Personnel Management, but you know the attacks are continuing, and one of interest that came up just recently was with the U.S. Senate, where the fancy bear guys, they're back, right? Or maybe they never left, tried to impersonate the Senate mail server, the ADFS site, by actually setting up a fake site for ADFS as well. Don't know to what extent that they were successful. It wasn't revealed. But that is what we're seeing. So before, in the case of like the hacking of Podesta, it was targeted at individuals setting up a fake Gmail site where they actually scraped or got the username and password. In this case, they're actually now setting up the login site for actual government agencies as well. Rob talked about Equifax, and so obviously probably most of our personal information was caught up in that. But one thing that I found was very interesting was that the day that it was announced that $4 billion of market cap disappeared. That was the stock price drop that's happening. So there is not only an impact on the actual users and their data that gets caught up in these breaches, but now people, when organizations actually get hacked, there's a pretty dramatic attack on the actual market capitalization. And so that cost over $4 billion for Equifax. And that doesn't even take into account the legal impact that they're no doubt going to face as well. Senator Markey talked about IoT. And so we're now seeing IoT devices being attacked. In this case, a DNS provider was knocked out because hackers had figured out that there was a set of IoT devices that had default passwords that were all the same, and they were directed against the actual DNS provider, and then in turn, those sites that relied on the DNS provider were also taken down. And then finally, getting back to the whole impact on shareholder value, we worked with this analyst organization called Ponymon Group, and we actually did a survey and a study that actually showed that that when a company announces a breach, that on average their stock actually goes down 5%. In the case of Equifax, it went down 35%. So no matter the size of the organization, the impact of a breach is pretty dramatic. One example is a food company, Chipotle, that their value actually went down $400 million. So there's now quantification of the actual impact, at least on public companies, in terms of what happens if a breach occurs. So the reality is that today's security is really not secure. We're spending about $86 billion, according to Gartner, on cybersecurity, and that's growing 8% year over year, but the number of breaches are actually increasing. And what's worse, we did a survey with Forrester where we interviewed 200 CIOs and CISOs of large government agencies and large enterprise companies. And they actually revealed, and this was a confidential survey that we did with them, that 2/3 of them had actually been breached. Even worse was the fact that they had been breached more than 5 times over the last year or so as well. So clearly what we're doing as it relates to cybersecurity is really not working, and we're losing the battle. And so it really means that we need to think anew about what we're supposed to be doing here. And at the same time that the number of attacks and breaches are dramatically increasing, we're actually going through a process of deperimeterization. And so it was good for Rob Joyce to talk about, he used the example of email to actually potentially move to a cloud-based offering for email. And I know a lot of government agencies are starting to aggressively look at the cloud, as well as also at the enterprise level as well. So we're now in a situation that increasingly more and more of IT is outside the corporate network, which brings about even more challenges as it relates to cybersecurity. And then the final thing is that what I want to bring up in this context of wanting and needing to rethink security is the fact that the attack vector has completely changed over the last few years. So the interesting thing is that Verizon does its data breach survey. 2 years ago, they actually said that 50% of breaches involve stolen or compromised credentials. That's gone from 60% to 80%. So 4 out of 5 breaches today are actually having to do with what Forrester, Chase Cunningham, who's going to present this afternoon, calls an inside job. It's either insiders doing things maliciously or inside people's credentials are stolen by outside people and being used. And the best type of credentials for a hacker are the privileged accounts associated with your systems, your network devices, et cetera, because those are the proverbial keys to the kingdom. So interestingly enough, that of the $80 billion plus that's being spent on cybersecurity, only about, say, 10% is being spent on identity-related protection, but it's 80% of the actual breaches involve stolen or compromised credentials. So there's a complete imbalance. And so I think that further drives the need to rethink what we're doing vis-a-vis security. So the threat landscape is getting worse. We now have deperimeterization going on, and identity is becoming the top attack vector. And so these various vectors are causing people to rethink the way that we go about doing security. And so there's this new concept. Well, it's actually not that new. It was introduced 4 or 5 years ago, but it's gaining a lot of momentum, which is called zero trust security. And so this afternoon is kind of the bookend to my conversation. We're going to hear from Forrester that's going to talk about what they call the zero trust security model. But also, independently, Google came up with this idea called Beyond Corp, which they're now aggressively implementing internally and evangelizing. So I'm not going to speak for Forrester, but I'm going to talk more about what Google Beyond Corp is about and how we can do Google Beyond Corp for all of us, because I know Google's a special company and has resources and assets that the average government agency, the average enterprise can't implement. But at the heart of zero trust is the realization that an internal user should be treated just like an external user, that your network is so diverse that the reality is it's probably your internal network is just going to be polluted as the outside network as well. And so you really need to move to get away from the concept that if someone is on my inside network, then they're given some sort of trust. And you need to throw that out. to a point where you don't trust anyone, and so you need to move to constant verification. So there was that expression, trust but verify. So now it's no trust and always verify, okay? And so that's kind of the heart of zero trust. So again, Forrester is going to talk this afternoon about what their vision is as it relates to zero trust. Let me just talk a little bit about Google. And it was actually born, it's not a conceptual thing. It actually was born out of necessity, that they and a bunch of other companies in Silicon Valley, as well as some federal system integrators, were actually hacked. And that happened in 2009. And the typical response when you get hacked was, oh, okay, let's beef up the firewall, let's do more with VPN, et cetera. And this actually gave them an opportunity to completely rethink what they were actually going to go about. And it took them a few years to think about it, but part of it was like, hey, we just can no longer rely on the VPN. Let's get to the point where we can actually remove the concept of a VPN and, again, go to the point where we need to verify the user, verify their device, and provide levels of authorization, encryption, et cetera. And the interesting thing is that what we're seeing with some of our leading edge customers is what we're starting to see in the press as well, that there's a growing awareness that, you know, actually, this is a really good way of going about things, okay? And we're also starting to see in the government as well that this Beyond Corp vision is without question, you know, one of the better visions for where you should move to as it relates to securing IT organizations. So let's drill down a little bit about what this is, what it means as well. And so what it says, and you can just Google Beyond Corp, and you go to a Google site where they talk more about it. But what it says is that connecting from a particular network must not determine which services you can access. Access to services granted based on, number one, what we know about you as a user, okay? And it's not simply just about your username and password and having single sign-on. It's about additional factors associated with you as well. And those factors can include what you've previously done. It can include other aspects, including your location, for example. So what we're starting to see is that in the old days, identity was always about, you know, certain attributes associated with the user and their password, you know, username, password. But now identity is really morphing well beyond that to include other attributes, including your location as well as your previous activity as well in terms of what's normal behavior as well. The second aspect of this is what we know about your device, okay? And there is certain levels of security associated with your device that determine whether or not you can actually get in. Has it been patched? Is it on the most recent version of the system as well? In addition, is this a device that you normally use? If this is a new device, maybe we should ask for additional forms of authentication to actually let you in. And then once we verify the user and verify the device, what Google talks about is that all access to services must be authorized. So this really is the concept of least privilege. So again, it's a move away from trust but verify to never trust but always verify as well. And so another way that you can actually represent that is what you want to do is verify the user, verify their device, limit access and privilege, and then from there, using more modern technologies such as machine learning, et cetera, to develop over time risk scores associated with users and learn and adapt. And so you can actually have contextual access associated with user activity. So a good example of that is, so I'm from California, and so if I go to the Starbucks right here, I get onto the Starbucks network, and so I'm not using a next-generation firewall. I'm accessing an application from, say, an iPad, which doesn't have any antivirus. I'm not VPNing in. So I'm not using any legacy technology. So how can you implement security in that environment? Well, you should certainly implement security in terms of enforcing, not actually having the user, in this case me, be able to type a password. on my iPad because someone could be looking over my shoulder. It should be kind of single-click access to the application and then having multi-factor authentication tied into, for example, biometrics. And then from there, having a cloud-based service that says, well, wait a minute, Tom never accesses from this type of device, so maybe I should actually ask, in this location, maybe I should ask for some additional forms of authentication, like respond to a notification, a push notification, et cetera, to really validate that it's me. In addition, you should be factoring in things which is, well, wait a minute, Tom 3 hours ago was in San Francisco, now he's in Washington, D.C. It's impossible for him to actually travel in that time frame as well. So those are the type of things that how security is moving to. It's instead of before the focus was on firewalls, VPNs, antivirus, where the focus is now shifting to verifying the user, verifying the device, limiting what privileges that I have, and then learning about what is normal behavior associated with that particular user as well. So let's drill down a little bit more on that. And so let's talk a little bit more about verifying the user. It's mind-boggling that, that in organizations, that most organizations haven't moved to a single sign-on environment. And by single sign-on, I'm not talking about actually, kind of a password wallet where it just simply replays passwords. That we should all be moving to an identity provider that can provide SAML-based authentication, or in case of internal networks, Kerberos-based authentication or PKI-based authentication for applications as well. And then layering on top of that is what I talked about before, and Rob Joyce also talked about, is the importance of multi-factor authentication. And what you should be doing is you should be leveraging a lot of the capabilities that you actually get with the devices that users have themselves. And so you can leverage biometrics, you can leverage push notification, et cetera. And then leveraging modern machine learning that you can actually start building out, and you guys should start thinking about this, is that how can I have behavior-based risk scoring associated with each and every user within the environment? So those are the aspects of what you need to think about when we talk about verifying the actual user itself. In terms of verifying the device, clearly the devices, be it mobile devices, be it the PCs or Macs that people are utilizing, should have endpoint security associated with, especially in the case of a Windows device. Yeah, should have anti-malware, antivirus, et cetera. But there's other aspects of that device that you should be thinking about as well. And so we talked about before, yes, single sign-on, using that device for multi-factor authentication, having risk-based score as well. But there should also be the fact that you should be thinking of each of the devices having an identity unto themselves, right? And then being able to take a look at the device and be able to actually determine whether or not the device meets your minimal standards, and then being able to also factor in location associated with the device as well. And then finally, especially for PCs or Macs, there should also be local account password management and local privilege management in terms of isolating what people can do on those actual devices. And in the case of local accounts, there should be management and security of the actual local accounts associated with the actual device, including the constant rotation as well. Because what we find is a lot of hacks happen is that, yeah, end users have their Macs, have their PCs, but but organizations will have the same password for all the local accounts and all their actual PCs, et cetera, and a hacker actually gets that and has full access, local super user on the actual device itself. And then finally, there should be the concept of limiting access and privilege. And what we're seeing is, especially with larger organizations, that when they're building out new infrastructure, the assumption is, when they start out, is they actually give access to this big pool of new infrastructure they've built. They give no access to it. And then from there, they just selectively grant access. So maybe kind of rethink about it. Maybe go back to your own environment and say, let's actually pull all access. Let's try to limit the lateral movement to that environment. And then from there, actually only give access based on a request basis. See, the interesting thing is, as CEO, I get emails all the time, notifications to approve things. I approve purchase orders, I approve vacation requests, et cetera. Sometimes I think I spent half my time approving things, right? But there's actually systems. There's ServiceNow, there's Workday, there's other automated systems to go through the approval process as well. But why don't we have similar type approval processes and systems to give root access to your actual servers, et cetera? You know, the interesting thing is that for business email compromise, and again, on a weekly basis, someone within my organization gets an email from Tom Kemp saying, wire me money, or do this, or do that, et cetera. And they're purposely trying to work around that approval process that we've actually set up, right? And so because we've tied everything in like with HR, with Workday, to NetSuite with our accounting, et cetera, that those type of requests are completely out of band, and they're quickly identified as, hey, this is an invalid request, because the way that I don't get requests via email from Tom to issue a purchase order. It comes through, you know, our accounting system as well. But why don't we actually have something comparable for access to our actual IT assets as well? And so I think there also needs to be that mentality as part of limiting access and privilege, that it should be completely service-driven, request-driven, et cetera, and applying that same mentality. And so access should be driven through group membership that should be tied to HR, right? So there should be HR-driven access. And then changes as well as requests for access should be driven through service management as well. We have those tools, we have those technologies, we implement them in other parts of our business. We should be applying that to actually accessing our infrastructure and apps. And then finally, there should be auditing of everything. All user-level activity should be caught, because again, 80% of the breaches involve stolen or compromised credentials, right? So that should be the focus of looking at abnormal behavior associated with users. Do they normally access this environment at this time from this type of device, et cetera? And so all this information should eventually feed into, you know, some sort of machine learning, and more technologies coming out in this area, where then from there, you can then do a better job of blocking access. You can do more conditional access and actually build rules associated with the levels of authentication that you require to access specific systems and applications, and then be able to eventually move to risk-based scoring and risk-based access as well. So those are the concepts, at least what Google's been talking about from a zero trust, and what Centrify has been focusing on implementing. And so people say, well, God, that sounds great, but that's all, you know, conceptual, et cetera. So the interesting thing is, as part of this survey that we actually did with Forrester, we looked at people that were implementing aspects of zero trust security compared to people that were further behind in moving to this model. And it was a pretty stark difference between the people that were further along in this path versus others. So again, this is a survey of 200 large enterprises and government agencies. And what we found was that actual organizations that had moved more to the zero trust model, and again, zero trust, you know, started 5-10 years ago, and smart people like Forrester, the analyst organizations, talking about Google did that through necessity and is implementing that internally as well. And what we found is that we talked about before that 2/3 of organizations had experienced a breach, and about 5 times as more. But people had actually moved to zero trust, saw 50% fewer breaches, and they actually saw improvements in terms of productivity. So the value that you actually have of delivering things such as single sign-on actually makes your end users significantly more productive in the environment. And in the end, you actually spend less on technology as well, which was really eye-opening to actually have some quantification associated with this move to zero trust. So it is a concept that, again, at least in the case of Google, was born out of necessity. And so we are facing perilous times. We are facing these hacks, breaches. I experience it personally. My company is always under attack because we have a cloud security platform that people want to get at, and our customers experience this as well. But I'm actually very excited because there's all this new technology, machine learning, big data, artificial intelligence that we can now apply to the problem. And there's also an opportunity to really start rethinking, because historically, we've been spending 80–90% of our time focusing on kind of fighting last year's war. But really, the world's changed. It's moving to the cloud, and identity is becoming the top attack vector, with 4 out of 5 breaches involving stolen or compromised credentials. And so this gives us a great opportunity to kind of step back and rethink what we do. And I think one area that we can really rethink is getting away from trusting but verifying, assuming that anyone that's on our corporate network, oh, well, they're good because they're on our corporate network, to actually thinking, look, I'm not going to trust anyone, and I need to move to verifying. So never trust, always verify. So thank you very much, and look forward to continuing the conversation.